Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for the invite, Gilbert and Alex. Like other speakers, I'm going to kind of riff off one of the sort of strands in the book. But whereas Natalie and Will have talked more about kind of big P politics, I'm going to speak more about something that relates to, yes, big P politics, but also kind of everyday life. So I'm going to talk about hegemony and work under neoliberalism. So I'm going to talk about how work, the organisation of work, our experience of work, how we think about ourselves as workers, what we might call our worker subjectivities, how they help to reproduce neoliberalism, but I would argue in ways that are contradictory and unstable. And specifically, I'm going to home in on the whole set of ideas around entrepreneurial cultures, logics, practices, subjectivities that are central to contemporary capitalism. And a lot has been written about this, the relationship between entrepreneurialism and neoliberalism, but hopefully I'll be able to add something interesting to that discussion. So to sort of step back and say why I'm choosing to speak about this, and indeed why it links to the book. So the bits of the book that I enjoyed the most were actually the kind of theoretical aspects where Joe and Alex kind of pin down what hegemony is and how it operates and how we should, the different levels at which we should kind of understand it. And they say two things here which I think are really important and linked to what I want to say about work. One is that hegemony is, in contrast to some kind of popular and academic misconceptions, isn't just about ideas, narratives, discourses, language, but also about social practices. So it's not just about what we think and what we say and what we believe, but also what we do and how we live our lives. And the second point there is that hegemony isn't sort of merely something that's won through persuasion, through attaining kind of active consent, but it's also something that involves everything along a spectrum from active consent to more coercive forms of consent, or maybe compliance is a better word, or acceptance of neoliberalism. And as I say, both of those things apply very much to work. Clearly, we spend more time working than we do almost anything else, and the capitalist organisation of job markets, of workplaces, of work processes plays a huge role in winning popular compliance with capitalism. Again, at a number of different levels, from active consent to sort of passive acceptance. One way to tell this story is actually to go back to Gramsci's thoughts on this, and so he and Gem and Alex mentioned this in the book and referenced it a couple of times. Gramsci's essay "Americanism and Fordism," where he speaks about how, in his words, hegemony was born in the factory in the USA in the 1920s. In other words, the whole sort of regime of accumulation that we now call Fordism, based on mass industrial production, the compliance with that, I'm calling it compliance rather than consent, wasn't just a product of state propaganda or education systems. It was also won by the bosses through their control of the workplace, through their organisation of the working day, through their use of technologies to monitor and discipline workers, but also through using kind of sociological research techniques to monitor the lives of workers outside of the workplace, which is, something super interesting and rather sinister. And the basic argument here is that if you're emotionally invested in your labour, you're not going to be very good on the Fordist production line. So therefore, you have the Fordist ruling class has to create a set of workers who are completely disinvested from their work, who are alienated from their labour and yet disciplined in their labour. Now, Gramsci also said that while that was broadly successful, the ruling class in the US was also kind of storing up problems for itself in various ways by creating the kind of alienated yet disciplined largely male industrial worker. And I'll come back to the point because I think it's crucial. But you might be thinking, what's that have to do with neoliberalism? And today, clearly, we've got a very different form of capitalism today, 100 years after Gramsci was writing Americanism and Fordism. Indeed, people use the term post-Fordism to talk about the kind of capitalism that we have today, which I don't think should be read as saying that there's no manufacturing work anymore, that there's no industrial labour, that there's no routine and deadening work in the global north or the global south. There clearly is, but obviously lots of things have changed. And Gem and Alex talk about many of those. So we've got the growth of the service sector as well as the welfare state and public services. We've got a tax on unions, not the complete destruction of trade union power, as both Natalie and Will were referring to, but the weakening of trade unions and their strength moving from manufacturing to public services. We've got outsourcing, we've got temporary contracts, we've got the growth of self-employment, we've got changes to the benefit system to replace unconditional benefits with conditional benefits, and we've got the rise of the internet, which also kind of reshapes and restructures the way that work happens. All of that means that post-Fordist capitalism requires a very different kind of worker to Fordist capitalism. And indeed, in some ways, you could say that it needs almost the opposite kind of worker, whereas the production line worker needs to be alienated from their labour. The knowledge worker, actually not just the knowledge worker, but a range of workers in contemporary capitalism need to be deeply invested in their work, need to identify themselves so closely with their work that they don't even draw a sharp boundary between work and non-work life. So then the question is, how is that kind of worker subjectivity created? Through many of the means, obviously, that I listed there and that Gem and Alex talk about, but also I think through the promotion of entrepreneurial culture and through the establishment of entrepreneurial practices and logics across society, really. Now, I want to clarify that, and by the way, people like Maurizio Lazzarato write really well about this, and he's got a great line on this, which is that he says that the contemporary worker is encouraged to think of themselves as a fragment of capital, so essentially as a small business. But what I wanted to say about that is that I think a lot of the time entrepreneurialism is understood as a disposition towards just making loads of money and getting rich. And clearly that's one kind of entrepreneurialism and that's one aspect of it, but that's not all there is to it. You've got your city boys and your petty bourgeois types for whom, getting rich quick is the main motivation. But I think you've got different kinds of entrepreneurialism that I'd associate with, for example, the creative and culture industries, with tech workers in the tech industry, and also with certain public sector workers. So Angela McRobbie, ex-colleague of ours, writes about what she calls craft entrepreneurialism, which I think is a really useful concept. And her idea here is basically that work comes to represent the aspirations, the political and artistic values of a whole generation of younger people who have rejected the conventional idea of a career and of work. It's important to note, as McRobbie says, this isn't just an ideological maneuver from the ruling class, from elites, to try and convince us that we should invest our desires in work. This kind of craft entrepreneurialism also comes about because of genuine desires for a more liberatory, a more autonomous, a more fluid, a more creative life. And my own sort of empirical research, I think, sort of backs this up, and I found that, in my research I was interviewing and observing and working with mainly younger people many of whom were creative industry freelancers, and some of the themes that came up was a great regard for personal creative autonomy, an orientation towards project-based sort of ad hoc collaborations rather than working for one organisation over a long period of time, an orientation towards self-branding, being very conscious of one's own kind of image and brand identity, including online. And another thing that came up time and time again was how all of this was bound up with the internet. Gem and Alex, I think at one point, I might be misquoting them here, I think they referred to the platforms as, the tech platforms, as a machine for manufacturing human subjectivity, which I think is a great phrase and really borne out by my research. And we can think about the ways that social media in particular encourages logics of individualism and self-promotion, as well as kind of reactive and provocative mode of political engagement, a focus on metrics, on stats as well. And also, you know, part of all this is surveillance, including self-surveillance. But what I wanted to kind of move towards the end of my bit by saying is that I don't think this is incompatible at all with actually a progressive or even left-wing outlook. And what I'm writing about in a paper that I'm working on at the moment is what I'm calling entrepreneurial leftism, which is a phenomenon that I'm hoping exists because I'm talking about it, which is where you get a fusion of left-wing political commitments and progressive values with an entrepreneurial, project-based mode of orientation towards political activity. And this makes perfect sense. So in Gramsci's terms, he says that Fordism, while it created a regime of accumulation which worked very well, it also laid the basis for worker resistance, because not only did it create alienated labourers, it also created the infrastructure that would enable the mass party to form and for the collective will to form at a national level more quickly than it had before. And I know that Jeremy's written about this in Common Ground in particular. So my question is, and so Gramsci's point there is that the control of the workplace, yes, it serves the interests of the ruling class, but it has this kind of contradictory effect of producing certain possibilities for resistance. So what I'm interested in is how can we look at post-Fordism in the same way? How can we look at the way in which we have a networked, resourceful, creative class of particularly younger workers, and think about how that can feed into practices of resistance. And I think actually that we're seeing that. If we think about what Gibaudo, in a slightly different context, refers to as political startups, we can see there's been a huge explosion of different kinds of small, ad hoc political organisations like Novara Media, the think tank Autonomy, even the World Transformed to some extent. These are all organisations which are established along very, very different lines and with very, very different cultures to the enduring bureaucratic, hierarchical political party or trade union of the 20th century. And I think it's useful to think about some of the challenges that presents. Young people who are used to fluid, autonomous, creative ways of working might not be so interested in being a foot soldier for a large bureaucratic organisation. And I think we've seen that with the fact that, for example, loads of young people joined Labour under Corbynism, but not many of the very youngest, we know from surveys, got involved in the work of the party. And it's hardly surprising if you go to a Labour meeting where you know, it's extremely boring, where there's lots of passing motions and discussing things and voting for slates. That's not particularly appealing if what you've been led to expect is excitement, is fulfillment, is creativity. And what I found was that the young people who I interviewed who expected that from their working lives expected it from their politics too. So my question is, if as Gramsci says, the task of the left is not to introduce from scratch a new way of doing things, but to renovate and make critical an existing activity. In other words, to build on what is there. How can we build on those desires for creativity, for autonomy, for stimulation and for fulfillment and for fluid ways of working, but do that within a larger project which is, as you guys put it, partisan in the sense that it is working with common purpose towards a common goal.